Welcome to Chronological Fiction, where real-world events meet the power of storytelling. We're here to breathe new life into history's most interesting moments by turning them into unique narratives. Join our community by subscribing, and let's explore the stories that shaped our world.
Chapter 1, The Pride of the North. Intro music, low, pulsing industrial drone, fading into the sound of cold waves crashing. The Barents Sea is a place where the world feels unfinished. It is a vast, grey expanse of Arctic water that guards the northern flank of Russia. In August of 2000, these waters were not just a graveyard of history, but a stage for a resurrection. Russia was seeking to reclaim its naval dignity after a decade of post-Soviet decay. And at the heart of this reclamation was a monster of steel, the K-141 Kursk. She was an Oscar II class nuclear submarine, a titan designed for a singular, terrifying purpose: to hunt and destroy American aircraft carrier battle groups. Imagine a vessel longer than 2 football fields, 154 meters of double-hulled reinforced steel. She was wider than a city street and stood as tall as a 4-story building. To her crew, she was the unsinkable. She was a city beneath the waves, powered by 2 nuclear reactors capable of traveling at speeds that defied her massive displacement. On August 12th, the Kursk was the crown jewel of the Summer X exercise, the largest naval drill Russia had attempted in over a decade. There were 30 ships and 3 submarines in the area. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and the biting cold of the Arctic summer. On board were 118 men. Some were seasoned veterans of the Cold War, others were boys. Conscripts who had written letters home just days before, complaining about the quality of the food, but marveling at the sheer power of the machine they inhabited. Captain Gennady Lyachin commanded the vessel with a reputation for being a sailor's captain. He knew that the world was watching. He knew that the success of Summer X would signal to the West that the Russian bear was no longer sleeping. But beneath the surface of the Pride lay the cracks of reality. The Kursk was a high-tech marvel, yes, but she was maintained on a shoestring budget. The torpedoes she carried, specifically the Type 6576 kit, used a volatile fuel known as high-test peroxide, or HTP. It was a substance the British Royal Navy had abandoned decades earlier because it was deemed too dangerous to handle. In the cramped, echoing hallways of the torpedo room, that danger was a silent passenger. As the Kursk submerged into the icy depths that Saturday morning, the mood was professional, even celebratory. They were prepared to fire a practice torpedo at the battlecruiser Pyotr Veliky. They were the elite. They were the invisible shield. They had no way of knowing that within hours their pride would become their tomb, and the silence of the Barents Sea would become their final legacy. Sound effect, the deep, rhythmic thrum of a nuclear reactor, slowly slowing down into a heartbeat. Then silence. Chapter 2. 2 minutes that changed everything. Transition, high-tension atmospheric synth. At 11:28 a.m. local time, the sonar operators on the nearby Pyotr Veliky felt a shudder. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical punch through the water. Inside the Kursk, the nightmare began in the first torpedo room. A weld on one of the practice torpedoes had failed. The HTP fuel leaked, reacting violently with the copper and silver in the torpedo tube. The resulting fire was instantaneous and white-hot. In those first few seconds, the men in the first compartment likely didn't even have time to scream. The pressure built until the torpedo casing disintegrated, causing an explosion equivalent to 100 kilograms of TNT. This first blast wasn't enough to sink the Kursk, but it was enough to incapacitate the command center. Smoke poured through the ventilation shafts. The giant settled toward the seabed, 108 meters down. But the worst was exactly 135 seconds away. The fire from the first blast raged in the nose of the ship. It licked at the remaining 5 live warheads. At 11:30 a.m., the Kursk suffered a second explosion so massive it was recorded by seismic stations as far away as Alaska. It was the equivalent of 3 to 7 tons of TNT. The bow of the submarine was torn open like a tin can. The double hull, designed to withstand the pressure of the deep ocean, was shredded. A wall of water, moving at supersonic speeds, punched through the first, second, third, and fourth compartments. Men were killed instantly by the pressure wave before the water could even reach them. The Kursk hit the seafloor with such force that it left a crater. The reactors, luckily, were shut down by the automated emergency systems, a final act of mechanical grace that prevented a nuclear catastrophe. But for the 118 men on board, the ship was now divided into two worlds, the world of the dead in the bow and the world of the dying in the stern. As the echoes of the second blast died away, 23 men found themselves alive in the only remaining dry spot. Compartment 9. Chapter 3. Compartment 9 to audio note, the sound of dripping water, echoing metallic groans, and the heavy, labored breathing of several men. The background music is a low, mournful cello. The silence that followed the second explosion was more terrifying than the noise. In the 9th compartment, the very rear of the ship, 23 men remained. They were the engineers, the mechanics, the men who worked furthest from the bow. Among them was Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov. As the emergency lights flickered and died, leaving them in a tomb of absolute pitch blackness, the reality of their situation began to settle. The Kursk was resting on the seabed at 108 meters. Above them was the crushing weight of the Barents Sea. Below them, a floor that was slowly tilting. Kolesnikov took command. In the flickering glow of a single handheld torch, he saw the faces of boys turned into old men. They gathered in the small space near the escape hatch. They could hear the hull groaning under the pressure. They could hear the distant muffled thuds of the debris settling. "It's dark here to write," Kolesnikov scribbled on a piece of paper, his handwriting shaky but determined. "But I'll try by feel. It seems there are no chances, 10 to 20%. Let's hope that at least someone will read this." For the next several hours, these 23 men became the bravest souls on Earth. They didn't panic. They followed protocol. They used chemical air scrubbers, cartridges designed to soak up carbon dioxide and release oxygen. But these cartridges were a double-edged sword. If they touched water, they would ignite. The air grew thick and oily. The temperature dropped toward freezing. They huddled together for warmth, sharing the few woolen jackets they had. Every few minutes, they would take a heavy wrench and bang on the hull. Clang, clang, clang. It was the rhythmic heartbeat of the dying. They hoped the sonar of the fleet above would hear them. List of personnel from the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th compartments who are now in the 9th, Kolesnikov wrote, meticulously documenting his men. Even at the edge of the abyss, he was an officer. He was making sure they wouldn't be forgotten. As the hours turned into a day, the oxygen levels plummeted. Carbon dioxide poisoning began to cloud their minds, bringing a merciful, heavy lethargy. In his final note, Kolesnikov wrote a message to his wife. "Olga, I love you. Do not despair." The end likely came when one of the air-scrubbing cartridges fell into the oily water, rising at their feet. A flash fire erupted, consuming the last of the oxygen in seconds. The 118th voice of the Kursk finally fell silent. Chapter 4. A race against bureaucracy. Audio note, shift to a faster, more chaotic tempo. Sounds of radio static, muffled shouting in Russian, and the churning of ship engines. On the surface, the Summer X exercise continued for hours before anyone realized the Kursk was missing. It wasn't until late Saturday evening that the Russian Navy declared an emergency. But the world didn't know yet. What followed was a masterclass in tragedy born of pride. The Russian Admiralty, led by men raised in the secrecy of the Cold War, refused to admit they had lost their crown jewel. When the British and Norwegians offered their state-of-the-art rescue submersibles, the LR-5, the Russian government said, "We have everything we need." They didn't. The Russian rescue bells, the Prise and the Besta, were relics. They were launched again and again into the storm-tossed seas. Each time they failed. Their batteries died, their docking seals, worn and poorly maintained, couldn't create a vacuum against the Kursk's hatch. While the families of the sailors gathered on the docks of Vidyayevo, crying out for answers, the Kremlin remained silent. President Vladimir Putin, only months into his first term, remained on vacation at the Black Sea. The optics were devastating. A nation's sons were suffocating while the leadership remained in the sun. By the time the Russian government finally relented and allowed British and Norwegian divers to assist, 5 days had passed. The international team arrived with a sense of grim urgency. On Monday, August 21st, Norwegian divers finally reached the ninth compartment hatch. They expected to hear banging. They expected to find a vacuum. Instead, when they turned the valve, they saw bubbles. The compartment was flooded. The divers lowered a camera into the darkness. They didn't find a miracle. They found the silent city. The image of the empty, flooded escape trunk was broadcast to a world that had held its breath for over a week. The 118 were gone. The tragedy of the Kursk was no longer a rescue mission. It was now a political firestorm and a massive recovery operation that would eventually see the entire 9,000-ton hull raised from the floor of the sea, minus the shattered bow. Chapter 5. Echoes in the Barents. Audio note. The music transitions from the chaotic tension of the rescue to a slow, mournful orchestral piece, low strings and a solitary trumpet. The sound of freezing wind remains in the background. The death of the 118 men on the Kursk was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a haunting autopsy. For a year, the Kursk sat on the floor of the Barents Sea, a 15,000-ton tomb of radioactive steel and human remains. But the Russian government, under immense domestic and international pressure, committed to something never before attempted in the history of naval engineering. They would raise the Titan from the depths. The engineering feat, the raising of the ghost. In 2001, a Dutch consortium, Mammoet Smit International, was contracted for the recovery. The world watched in awe as a giant barge, the Giant 4, was modified to lift the submarine. The operation was a nightmare of physics. The bow of the Kursk, shattered and filled with unexploded torpedoes, was too unstable to lift. Divers had to descend into the murky, freezing depths to saw the nose off the ship using a massive diamond-studded tungsten carbide cable. It was a delicate, terrifying dance with death. One wrong move, one spark against a live warhead, and the recovery team would join the crew of the Kursk. Once the bow was severed, 26 giant hydraulic jacks lowered steel cables into the hull. On October 8, 2001, the Kursk finally broke suction with the seabed. As the massive hull was pulled toward the surface, it felt as though the ocean itself was reluctant to let go of its prize. When the submarine was finally docked in the Roslyakovo shipyard, the world saw the true scale of the violence. The front of the ship was a jagged, blackened maw, a testament to the power of the HTP explosion. The autopsy of a tragedy. Inside the dry dock, the grim work began. Investigators moved through the silt and the twisted metal. They found the bodies of 115 of the 118 sailors. Most were identified, but 3 remained forever part of the ship, lost to the initial blast. As they cleared the 9th compartment, they found the physical evidence of the survivors' final hours. They found the scorched walls from the flash fire and, most importantly, the letters. Dmitry Kolesnikov's note was found in a waterproof pocket close to his heart. When his words were released to the public, they didn't just tell the story of a disaster, they gave the victims a voice that the government had tried to stifle. The investigation eventually confirmed the nightmare. A faulty weld in a practice torpedo had allowed HTP to leak. The torpedo had been dropped during transport, a fact that was ignored in the rush to begin the Summer X exercises. It was a tragedy of systemic negligence, a collision between a grand military ambition and a crumbling infrastructure. The legacy of the 118, the Kursk, changed Russia. It was the first major crisis of the 21st century for the nation, a moment that exposed the tension between the old Soviet culture of secrecy and the new era of global transparency. In the town of Vidyayevo, where the families of the crew still live, there is a monument. It is a simple piece of the Kursk's sail standing against the grey sky. Every year on August 12th, the bells of the local church ring 118 times. The tragedy also led to a revolution in submarine rescue. Today, international cooperation in the deep sea is no longer a political choice, but a humanitarian necessity. The Global Submarine Rescue Alliance was born from the failure to save the 23 men in Compartment 9. As we look back at the K-141 Kursk, we don't just remember the steel, the reactors, or the Cold War politics. We remember the men. We remember the sound of a wrench hitting a hull, a heartbeat in the dark, reminding us that even in the deepest, coldest depths of the ocean, the human spirit refuses to go quietly. Technical deep dive. A. The architecture of an undersea titan. Estimated runtime 15 minutes. Audio note: the background noise shifts to a clean, rhythmic electronic pulse. Think educational but serious. Sound of a blueprint being unrolled. To understand why the world was so shocked by the sinking of the Kursk, one must understand the sheer engineering audacity of the Project 949A Ante, known to NATO as the Oscar II class. The Kursk was not just a submarine, it was a carrier killer. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union realized they could not match the United States ship for ship in a surface battle. Their solution was asymmetrical warfare, building a submarine so powerful it could sink an entire American aircraft carrier from hundreds of miles away. The double hull construction: most Western submarines, like the American Los Angeles class, use a single hull design. The Kursk, however, was a Russian nesting doll. She had an inner pressure hull made of high-quality magnetic steel and an outer hydrodynamic hull. Between these two layers was a gap of nearly 2 meters. This design was intended to make the ship unsinkable. The outer hull could take a torpedo hit or a collision, leaving the inner pressure hull intact. This is why, when the first explosion occurred, many experts believed the Kursk was still safe. They didn't realize the blast had originated inside the pressure hull, turning the ship's greatest strength into its greatest weakness. The arsenal, along the sides of the Kursk, angled at 45 degrees, were 24 massive launch tubes. These held the P-700 Granite missiles, monsters the size of small fighter jets. Each missile weighed 7 tons and carried a 750-kilogram high-explosive warhead, or a nuclear one. But it wasn't the missiles that killed the Kursk. It was the Fat Girl, the Type 65-76 torpedo. At 30 feet long and weighing nearly 5 tons, it was one of the largest torpedoes in the world. It was designed to travel at 50 knots for over 30 miles. To achieve this speed and range, it used high-test peroxide, HTP. The chemical catalyst HTP is not fuel in the traditional sense, it is an oxidant. When it comes into contact with a catalyst like silver or copper, it expands 5,000 times in volume almost instantly, creating high-pressure steam and oxygen. In a controlled engine, this provides incredible power. In a leak, it becomes a blowtorch that can melt through steel in seconds. The tragedy of the Kursk was that the Russian Navy knew HTP was dangerous. The British Royal Navy had suffered a similar disaster in 1955 on the HMS Sidon and had banned the substance immediately. The Russians, however, kept it because it was cheap and powerful. On the morning of August 12th, that cost-saving measure became a death warrant. Technical deep dive, B. The physics of the abyss. Estimated runtime 12 minutes. Audio. Note: the sound of heavy water pressure, a slow creak of metal, and the distant ping of a sonar. When the Kursk settled on the floor of the Barents Sea, she was at a depth of 108 meters, 354 feet. To a human on the surface, that sounds deep. To a submariner, it is shallow. The Kursk was nearly 155 meters long. If you stood the submarine up on its nose, half of it would have been sticking out of the water. This is the ultimate irony of the tragedy. The crew was so close to the surface, yet they were in a different world. The pressure factor. At 108 meters, the water pressure is roughly 11 atmospheres. This means that for every square inch of the submarine's hull, there were about 160 pounds of pressure pressing inward. If a hatch is opened at that depth, without equalizing the pressure, the water doesn't just flow in. It enters with the force of a hydraulic jet. It can cut through flesh and bone instantly. This is why the Norwegian divers had to work with such extreme caution. They weren't just fighting the cold and the dark, they were fighting the physics of the ocean itself. The bubble pulse seismologists in Norway and as far away as Scotland recorded 2 distinct spikes on their graphs that morning. Using the data, they could calculate the exact energy released. The second explosion was so powerful that it created a bubble pulse. The blast created a massive bubble of gas that expanded, collapsed, and expanded again. This cycle happened so fast that it acted like a secondary hammer blow, shattering the internal bulkheads of the first 5 compartments. When the rescuers finally reached the ship, they found that the heavy steel doors, designed to keep the ocean out, had been bent like wet cardboard. The physics of the explosion were so violent that the men in the command center, Compartment 2, were likely killed by the air pressure change alone, milliseconds before the water even reached them. Character profile: the women of Vidyayevo. Estimated runtime: 18 minutes. Audio. Note: the sound of a cold wind whistling through a desolate town. A distant, sad piano melody. To understand the Kursk, you must understand Vidyayevo. This is a closed military town, a place that doesn't exist on many maps. It is a cluster of grey concrete apartment blocks carved into the Arctic rock. In August 2000, Vidyayevo was a town of waiting. The phone that didn't ring. Submariners' wives are a different breed. They are used to the long silence, the months when their husbands vanish beneath the waves with no contact. But the Summer X exercise was supposed to be short. When the ships began returning to port without the Kursk, the silence changed. It became heavy. Nadezhda Tylik and the needle. One of the most haunting images of the Kursk tragedy involves Nadezhda Tylik, the mother of a young sailor. During a televised meeting with government officials, she stood up and screamed in grief and rage, demanding to know why the government was lying about the rescue. As she shouted, a woman in civilian clothes stepped up behind her and injected her with a sedative through her clothing. Nadezhda collapsed into her seat, silenced. It was a chilling metaphor for how the state handled the disaster. If the truth is too loud, numb the person telling it. The letters from the deep when the bodies were finally recovered, and the letters from the 9th compartment were given to the families, the official version of the story crumbled. The government had claimed everyone died instantly. The letters proved that 23 men had lived for hours, perhaps days. For the widows of Vidyayevo, this was a second trauma. They had to live with the knowledge that while they were standing on the docks, looking out at the grey sea, their husbands were alive, 100 meters down, banging on the hull, waiting for a rescue that would never come. Chapter 6. The Geopolitical Chessboard. Estimated runtime: 15 minutes. Audio note: the sound of old radio broadcasts in various languages, English, Russian, French, overlapping and fading into a low, rhythmic drumbeat. In August 2000, the Cold War had been over for nearly a decade, but the ghosts of the Soviet era still haunted the hallways of the Kremlin. The Summer X exercise wasn't just a training mission, it was a statement. Russia was under new management. Vladimir Putin had been inaugurated as president only months prior. He had promised to restore the vertical of power and bring pride back to a military that had been humiliated by poverty and neglect throughout the 1990s. The NATO shadow. While the Kursk was moving through the Barents Sea, she wasn't alone. 2 American hunter-killer submarines, the USS Memphis and the USS Toledo, along with a British Swiftsure-class boat, were loitering in the vicinity. Their mission was simple: watch, listen, and record. When the 2 explosions rocked the seabed, the Americans heard it. Their sophisticated sonar arrays captured the acoustic signature of the disaster. Within hours, intelligence analysts in Washington and London knew that a Russian Oscar II had suffered a catastrophic event. But they couldn't say anything without revealing how closely they were spying on Russian sovereign waters. The wall of silence. For the first 48 hours, the Russian Navy maintained a business-as-usual facade. While the Kursk lay broken on the floor, the Admiralty issued reports saying the exercise was proceeding normally. This was the old Soviet reflex: secrecy over safety. To admit the Kursk was in trouble was to admit that the unsinkable was vulnerable. To admit they needed help was to admit that the Russian motherland was no longer a superpower that could care for its own. By the time the news broke on Monday morning, the narrative was already poisoned by misinformation. The Russian officials claimed a collision with a foreign vessel was the cause. This sparked a terrifying moment of tension where the world wondered if the Kursk was the opening shot of a new war. Technical deep dive. C. The science of the deep. Estimated runtime: 15 minutes. Audio note: the sound of a laboratory. Beakers clinking, the hiss of a gas valve. The narrator's tone becomes more analytical. To truly appreciate the horror of the men trapped in Compartment 9, we must look at the chemistry of their environment. They were fighting a war on 3 fronts: cold, pressure, and poison. The physics of pressure at a depth of Mars Sea is 108 hours text, Mars meters, bars. The ambient pressure per dollars can be calculated using the hydrostatic pressure formula. Ipa pico sid P is ATM, ausis, ara o, G where P GEM is atmospheric pressure. Beatrius approx 101,125 odd text. EP is the density of seawater. Bashali approxis 125 odd text. Q 3. G dal is the acceleration due to gravity. Bas approx 9.8 new text plus mem ses a 2. At 108 meters, the pressure is approximately p lash approximately 101,325 plus 1,025 times 9.81 times 108. As approx 187,000 pure text Porsche p that is roughly 11.7 atmospheres. If the hull had suffered even a pinhole leak in the ninth compartment, the water would have entered as a high-velocity needle, capable of cutting through the sailors' dry suits. The chemical air scrubber failure, the 23 survivors relied on potassium superoxide, KO2 cartridges to survive. The chemical reaction to remove carbon dioxide, CO2, and regenerate oxygen, O2 follows this basic pathway. 4KO 2 plus 2 KO2 plus right arrow 2K 2 KO3 plus 3O2. This reaction is exothermic. It produces heat. However, KO2 is violently reactive with water. When the ninth compartment began to flood slowly from the propeller shaft seals, the water eventually touched a dropped cartridge. The resulting reaction was not just a fire, it was an oxygen-enriched flash. In the confined high-pressure atmosphere of the ninth compartment, the fire would have behaved like an explosion, consuming the remaining life-sustaining gas in a heartbeat. Chapter 7. The Seaway Eagle and the Foreign Divers. Estimated runtime, 20 minutes. Audio note. The sound of heavy machinery, the Seaway Eagle ship's horn, and the splashing of divers entering the water. Background music is high-tempo, industrial, and urgent. While the Russian rescue bells pris were failing due to poor seals and depleted batteries, a team of British and Norwegian specialists was waiting in the wings. The LR-5 submersible, the British had brought the LR-5, a state-of-the-art rescue submersible. Unlike the Russian bells, the LR-5 had a skirt made of flexible materials that could create a seal even on a damaged, debris-strewn hatch. The British pilots were ready to dive within hours of arriving at the site, but they were forced to wait. For days, the Russian military refused to give them permission to submerge. The Russian admiral, Vyacheslav Popov, was caught between his desire to save his men and the strict orders from Moscow to keep foreign eyes away from the Kursk's sensitive sonar and missile technology. The Norwegian divers, breaking the seal on August 20th, the Norwegian ship Seaway Eagle finally received the green light. The divers who descended were elite saturated divers. They didn't use standard air. They breathed heliox, a mixture of helium and oxygen, to prevent nitrogen narcosis at that depth. When the Norwegians reached the rear escape hatch, they found it was covered in silt and debris. Using specialized tools, they cleared the hatch. One diver, Tony Scott, recounted the eerie silence. He used a hammer to tap on the hatch. He waited. There was no answer, no heartbeat of the ship. Using a specialized tool to test for air pressure, they discovered that the trunk was full of water. When they finally forced the hatch open on August 21st, a single large bubble of foul-smelling gas escaped to the surface. It was the final breath of the Kursk. The divers reported seeing the bodies of the men through the camera feed. One of the Norwegians later remarked, "The hardest part wasn't the depth or the cold. It was the realization that we could have been there 5 days earlier." Chapter 8. The Aftermath. A Nation in Mourning. Estimated runtime, 15 minutes. Audio. Note. The sound of a single church bell. The music shifts back to the somber orchestral theme from earlier. When the death of all 118 men was officially confirmed, a dark cloud settled over Russia. The initial pride of the Summer X exercise had turned into a national trauma. The funeral of the unsinkable funerals were held across the country. In St. Petersburg, in Sevastopol, and in the small village of Vidyayevo. Many of the families refused to accept the government's pension offers at first. They didn't want money. They wanted the truth. The Kursk disaster forced the Russian Navy to modernize. It led to the decommissioning of the dangerous HTP torpedoes and a complete overhaul of their rescue protocols. But for the families of the 118, these were cold comforts. The eternal patrol in the naval tradition, a submarine that does not return, is said to be on eternal patrol. The Kursk remains a symbol of the transition between two eras of history. She was a relic of Cold War aggression that met her end in a world that was trying, however awkwardly, to learn how to cooperate. As the credits roll on this story, we are left with the image of a piece of paper, the note found in Dmitry Kolesnikov's pocket. It was water-stained and crumpled, but its message remains clear to this day. It is a message not of military duty, but of human connection. To all the families, he wrote, "Don't despair." Chapter 9. The War of Information. Estimated runtime 18 minutes. Audio. Note: the sound of aggressive camera shutters, the distorted audio of news anchors in multiple languages, and the distant rhythmic chanting of a protesting crowd. While the men in Compartment 9 were facing the physical reality of the deep, a different kind of war was being waged on the surface. A war of narratives. This was perhaps the first time in modern history that a Russian domestic tragedy became a global reality television event, and the Kremlin was utterly unprepared for the scrutiny. The myth of the collision. For the first 72 hours, the Russian Admiralty pushed a specific theory. The Kursk had been struck by a foreign submarine, likely an American or British one. They claimed to have found greenish-gray emergency buoys that didn't belong to the Russian Navy. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a calculated attempt to shift the blame from poor maintenance and volatile torpedoes to Western aggression. The Russian public, still nursing the wounds of the Cold War, initially believed it. But as the days turned into a week and no evidence was produced, the anger began to turn inward. The families versus the state. The town of Vidyayevo became the epicenter of this anger. In a humid, crowded auditorium, high-ranking admirals stood before the wives and mothers of the crew. It was a scene of raw, Shakespearean tragedy. It was here that the world saw the true face of the disaster. When the officials spoke in circles, the women didn't just cry, they roared. They demanded to know why international help had been rejected for 5 days. They demanded to know if their sons were still banging on the hull. The state's response, the literal physical sedation of Nadezhda Tylik as she screamed at the podium, became the symbol of the Kursk. It was the moment the Russian public realized that for their government, the prestige of the state was more valuable than the lives of 118 sailors. Chapter 10. The Giant 4, a mechanical miracle. Estimated runtime 20 minutes. Audio. Note: the sound of heavy metal grinding, the deep hum of massive hydraulic pumps, and the splashing of heavy seas against a steel barge. Raising a 9,000-ton nuclear submarine from 108 meters is not just a towing job, it is one of the most complex salvage operations ever attempted. By 2001, the Russian government realized they had to bring the Kursk home, both to bury the men and to silence the rumors that the reactors were leaking. The Dutch engineering, they hired the Dutch companies Mamoet and Smit International. The plan was as bold as it was dangerous. They would use a giant barge, the Giant 4, equipped with 26 massive hydraulic jacks. Each jack was connected to a cable made of 54 individual steel strands. But there was a problem: the bow. The first compartment was a twisted mess of unexploded torpedoes and unstable propellant. If they tried to lift the whole ship, the bow might break off and trigger a secondary explosion. The Diamond saw. The solution was to amputate the nose of the submarine. Divers went down and attached a giant diamond-studded cutting cable. For days, the cable was pulled back and forth by powerful motors on the surface, soaring through the reinforced steel of the Kursk. Once the bow was severed and left on the sea floor, The giant four positioned itself directly over the hull. One by one, the jacks engaged. The tension was immense. If even one cable snapped, the sudden shift in weight could capsize the barge and sink the entire operation. Slowly, at a rate of only a few meters per hour, the Kursk rose. On October 8, 2001, for the first time in over a year, the hull of the K-141 broke the surface of the Barents Sea. She was a ghost ship, covered in silt and sea life. But she was finally coming home. Chapter 11, 26 years later. The Ghost and the Legacy, 2000 to 226. Estimated runtime, 15 minutes. Audio note: the sound of a cold wind blowing through an empty shipyard. A solitary, low-pitched sonar ping that echoes and fades into a soft, ambient synth pad. It has been over a quarter of a century since the Kursk fell silent. As we stand here in 2026, the world of submarine warfare has changed, yet the lessons of that August morning remain chillingly relevant. The aftermath of the ship. After the bodies were recovered and the investigation concluded, the Kursk was scrapped. The nuclear reactors were removed and placed into long-term storage. Today, all that remains of the physical ship is the conning tower, the sail, which stands as a monument in Murmansk. It is a jagged piece of steel that serves as a headstone for 118 men. The Kursk effect on global rescue. The tragedy triggered a global shift. Today, the International Submarine Escape and Rescue Liaison Office, ISMERLO, ensures that if a submarine goes down, whether it is American, Russian, or Chinese, the call for help is immediate and the response is international. We saw this in the search for the Argentine submarine ARA San Juan in 2017 and the Indonesian KRI Nanggala in 2021. The pride that killed the Kursk's crew has mostly been replaced by a brotherhood of the deep. Final reflection. As the audiobook concludes, we return to the silence of the Barents Sea. The water there is 4 degrees Celsius. It is dark, it is unforgiving. We remember Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov, not as a victim, but as a chronicler of the human spirit. In the final moments of his life, he didn't write about the technical failures of his ship or the politics of his admirals. He wrote to his wife about love. The Kursk is no longer a weapon of war. She is a reminder that even in the most high-tech machines ever built, the most important component is the human heart. And when those hearts stop beating in the dark, the rest of the world has a duty to listen to the silence they leave behind. Chapter 12. The Anatomy of a Fault. The Kit Torpedo. Estimated runtime 18 minutes. Audio. Note: the sound of a metal factory, clanging, the hiss of welding, and a low, ominous bass note. To understand why the Kursk died, we must look at a single piece of recycled hardware, the Type 6576A Kit Torpedo. This was not a modern weapon. It was a design from 1953, a relic of the mid-Cold War era. The torpedo that triggered the disaster had been recycled. In the cash-strapped Russian Navy of the late 90s, equipment was often refurbished rather than replaced. This specific torpedo had a faulty weld in its casing. Imagine a pressurized tank filled with high-test peroxide, HTP, a substance so volatile that it begins to boil and expand the moment it touches a catalyst. As the crew slid the torpedo into tube number 4, the stress on the hull and the vibrations of the ship likely caused that faulty weld to finally give way. Inside the tube, the HTP began to leak. It reacted with copper and silver components, creating a high-pressure gas that had nowhere to go. The first explosion wasn't the warhead, it was the torpedo's own fuel tank. It blew the inner and outer doors of the torpedo tube off their hinges. But here is the tragedy. The hatch between the torpedo room and the rest of the ship had been left open to balance the air pressure, a violation of safety protocols that allowed the fire and the shockwave to travel instantly into the second compartment, the command center. The unsinkable ship was blinded and deafened within the first 10 seconds. The men who should have blown the emergency ballast tanks were already unconscious or dead. Chapter 13. The Failed Dives of the AS-34. Estimated runtime 22 minutes. Audio note: the sound of a struggling engine underwater, the mechanical whine of a motor failing, and the sound of waves crashing against a metal hull. For 4 days, the Russian rescue ship Mikhail Rudnitsky sat over the wreck site. On its deck were the AS-32 and AS-34 Prize-class rescue submersibles. These were supposed to be the elite lifeboats of the deep, but the reality was a nightmare of neglect. The Prize vehicles had been stripped for parts for years. Their batteries could barely hold a charge. Their docking rings, the rubber seals meant to create a vacuum against the Kursk's hatch, were perished and cracked from age. The 5 attempts, first attempt, the AS-34 descended through a storm. It hit the Kursk's stern stabilizer, damaging its own hull. It had to surface without even reaching the hatch. Second attempt, the batteries failed halfway down. The pilot had to blow emergency tanks just to survive the ascent. Third and fourth attempts, the submersibles reached the hatch, but they couldn't mate. The Kursk was listing at a 20-degree angle, and the Russian rescue tech couldn't handle the slope. The seals leaked, and the rescuers could hear the water rushing into their own tiny cabins. The fifth attempt. By the time the final attempt was made, the heartbeat of the Kursk, the rhythmic banging from the survivors, had stopped. The world watched as these red and white mini-subs were hoisted back onto the deck of the Rudnitsky like broken toys. It was the ultimate humiliation for a once great navy. They had the brave men to do the job, but they had given them tools made of rust. Chapter 14. The Bitter Price of Silence. Estimated runtime 20 minutes. Audio. Note the sound of a pen scratching on paper, a woman sobbing softly, and the distant tolling of a bell. After the funerals, a new tragedy began for the families, the fight for the truth. In 2001, the Russian government offered a compensation package that was, at the time, unprecedented. Each family received an apartment and roughly $20,000, a fortune in post-Soviet Russia. But many felt this was blood money, a bribe to keep them from asking why the rescue had been delayed. Boris Kuznetsov, the lawyer who represented 55 of the families, spent years fighting to prove that the government had lied about how long the men lived. If the men in compartment 9 had lived for 2 or 3 days, as some evidence suggests, then the government's refusal of foreign aid was not just a mistake, it was manslaughter. The 25th anniversary, August 12, 2025. As we look back from the perspective of 2026, the 25th anniversary of the disaster in 2025 served as a somber milestone. In the Serafimovskoye Cemetery in St. Petersburg, the names of the 118 are carved in stone. The political landscape has changed, but the shadow of the Kursk remains. Reports that surfaced during the anniversary revisited the darkest rumors of the time, allegations that the government referred to the grieving widows as hired discreditors. Whether true or not, the fact that these stories still resonate 25 years later shows that the wound has never fully healed. The Kursk was the moment the new Russia was forged in fire, a Russia that chose state power over individual transparency. Chapter 15. The Epilogue. The Names in the Dark. Estimated runtime 15 minutes. Audio. Note, no music, just the sound of a slow, deep heartbeat and the names read with a slight echo. We conclude this journey with the voices that matter. Not the admirals, not the presidents, and not the engineers. We remember Captain Gennady Lyashin, who stayed at his post in the command center. We remember Boris Gutin, who was found in the second compartment. We remember the young conscripts, barely 19 years old, who were seeing the ocean for the first time. And we remember the final words of Dmitry Kolesnikov, written in the pitch black. It is 15:15. All personnel from the 6th, 7th, and 8th compartments have moved to the 9th. There are 23 of us here. We have made the decision to stay because none of us can leave via the escape hatch. I am writing this by feel. As the sounds of the Barents Sea wash over the hull of the Kursk monument today, those words serve as a bridge. They remind us that the silent service is only silent because we aren't listening. The K-141 Kursk is gone, but the 118 souls are still there, in the memory of the water and in the echo of every sonar ping that travels through the deep. Chapter 16. The Silent Heart. The Miracle of the Reactors. Audio note, a rhythmic humming sound, the sound of a massive electric generator, low-frequency vibrations that represent the power of a nuclear heart. One of the greatest fears during the Kursk disaster was not just the loss of life, but the threat of an underwater Chernobyl. The Kursk was powered by two OK-650B pressurized water reactors, each capable of producing 190 megawatts of thermal power. The automatic scram, when the second explosion, equivalent to nearly 7 tons of TNT, ripped through the forward compartments, the shockwave was so violent it should have shattered the reactor cooling systems. However, the engineers in Compartment 5, the reactor compartment, had designed for the unthinkable. The moment the first explosion occurred, the scram system engaged. Control rods, made of neutron-absorbing materials, were fired into the reactor cores to stop the chain reaction. But the real miracle happened during the second blast. Despite the hull being torn open, the reactor shields held. The final act of the engineers' evidence, found during the recovery, suggests that the reactor crew lived long enough to ensure the cooling systems were stable. They sacrificed their own chances of reaching the escape hatch in the stern to ensure the reactors wouldn't melt down. If those reactors had breached, the Barents Sea, one of the world's most productive fishing grounds, would have been radioactive for decades. The men of the Kursk saved the Arctic ecosystem while their own world was collapsing around them. Chapter 17. The World is Watching. The First Digital Tragedy. Audio. Note: the sound of old dial-up internet noises, frantic typing, and news clips from CNN and the BBC playing in the background. The Kursk tragedy occurred at a unique moment in history, the dawn of the 24-hour global internet news cycle. In 1991, the world watched the Gulf War on TV. In 2000, the world watched the Kursk on the web. The information gap. For the first time, people in Moscow were reading reports from London and Washington that contradicted their own government. This created a digital rift. While the Russian Admiralty was claiming they had established contact with the crew via radio, Western news outlets were reporting that sonar data suggested no one could have survived the second blast. The rise of independent media inside Russia, this was the final stand of independent television. Channels like NTV showed the raw, unedited grief of the families. They showed the sedated mother, the angry widows, and the crumbling naval infrastructure. It was this media pressure that eventually forced President Putin to return from his vacation and address the nation. The Kursk became a case study in how the internet can break a state's monopoly on the truth. By 2026, we see this as the moment the information war became a permanent part of global tragedy management. Chapter 18. Shadows of the Memphis. Debunking the Conspiracy. Audio note: high-tension investigative music, low pulsing bass and sharp metallic sounds. For years, a persistent theory circulated in the darker corners of military forums that the Kursk didn't sink because of a faulty torpedo, but because it was rammed or torpedoed by the USS Memphis or the USS Toledo. The theory's proponents of this theory point to a circular hole in the side of the recovered hull, claiming it was the entry point of an American Mk-48 torpedo. They suggest that the two U.S. submarines were spying too closely. A collision occurred, and the Americans fired in self-defense. The reality of physics. The 2002 official investigation, supported by the Dutch salvage team, thoroughly debunked this. The hole was actually the result of the internal explosion bowing the hull outward and the subsequent impact with the sea floor. Furthermore, the acoustic data recorded by Norwegian seismic stations showed two distinct explosions, not the sound of a collision. More importantly, if a U.S. submarine had collided with the 18,000-ton Kursk, the American boat, half the size, would have been obliterated. The conspiracy remains a fascinating look at the lingering Cold War mindset, a refusal to believe that a titan of the sea could be brought down by something as simple as a poorly welded pipe. Chapter 19. The Sister Ships. The Legacy of the Oscar II. Audio note: the sound of a ship's horn echoing across a vast harbor, the sound of wind and seagulls. The Kursk was one of many. Her sister ships, the Omsk, the Tomsk, and the Smolensk, continued to serve long after her demise. The refit. Following the disaster, the entire Oscar II class underwent massive safety overhauls. The Type 65-76 torpedoes were removed from service entirely. The escape hatches were redesigned to be compatible with NATO rescue equipment. As of 2026, some of these massive vessels have been converted into special-purpose submarines, carrying smaller deep-sea submersibles for seabed research and infrastructure protection. The Kursk's death ensured that her sisters would be safer, more modern, and less isolated from the rest of the world. Chapter 20. Conclusion. The 118th name. Audio note. The music fades to a very low, ambient drone. The sound of a pen on paper returns. We end where we began, in the silence, in the city of Kursk, for which the submarine was named. There is a classroom. On one of the desks, there is a nameplate. It belongs to a sailor who once sat there dreaming of the sea. Across Russia, there are 118 of these ghosts. The tragedy of the Kursk is a story of technology versus humanity. It is a story of how a machine built for the end of the world met its own end on a quiet Saturday morning. But more than anything, it is a story of the 23 men in the 9th compartment who, in their final hours, chose to be sailors, chose to be brothers, and chose to be human. The Barents Sea is cold, but the memory of the Kursk is white-hot. Chapter 21. The Captain's Mourning. Gennady Lyakin's final mission, estimated runtime, 25 minutes. Audio note. The sound of a pen scratching on paper, the low hum of a heater in a small cabin, and the distant, muffled sound of a harbor waking up. Captain First-Rank Gennady Lyakin was not a man of many words. In the closed military town of Vidyayevo, he was known as a sailor's sailor, a man who spent more time in the steel belly of a submarine than in his own living room. On the morning of August 12, 2000, Lyakin stood on the bridge of the Kursk, watching the Arctic sun struggle to break through the grey mist of the Barents Sea. He was 45 years old, at the peak of his career. The Summer X exercise was his chance to prove that the Northern Fleet was still a force to be reckoned with. But as he looked at his crew, 118 men, many of them barely out of their teens, he felt the weight of a different responsibility. The Russian Navy was broke. He knew that some of his men hadn't been paid in months. He knew that the unsinkable Kursk was carrying torpedoes that were older than the conscripts loading them. The interior of the Titan, as the Kursk prepared to dive, Lyakin walked through the ship. To the listener, this walk takes time. In an Oscar II-class sub, you don't just walk, you traverse a labyrinth. He passed the galley, where the smell of cabbage soup and cheap tea lingered. He walked through the missile decks, where the 24 granite missiles sat in their silos like silent slumbering gods. He checked on the reactor room, where the young engineers monitored the glowing heart of the ship. Lyakin felt every vibration of the hull. A submarine is a living thing. It groans as the pressure of the sea begins to squeeze. At 08:30 a.m., he gave the order, dive. The sound of the vents opening, a massive rhythmic whoosh of air, was the last sound many of these men would hear from the surface world. For Lyakin, the mission was simple: fire a practice torpedo at the flagship Pyotr Veliky. Success meant a medal, failure meant a quiet retirement. He had no idea that within 3 hours he would be presiding over a graveyard. Chapter 22. The 23 Souls, Life and Death in Compartment 9, estimated runtime 35 minutes. Audio note. This section should be read very slowly. The background sound is almost silent, interrupted only by the rhythmic drip, drip of water and the heavy, rasping sound of men breathing in a confined space. When the second explosion tore the front of the Kursk away, the 23 men in the rear of the ship were thrown against the bulkheads. In Compartment 9, the furthest point from the blast, the world didn't end in fire, it ended in darkness. Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov woke up on a cold steel floor. The emergency lights were dead. The air was already beginning to smell of ozone and burnt insulation. He didn't know yet that the first 5 compartments were gone. He didn't know he was 108 meters below the surface. The psychological siege, imagine the silence. 23 men huddled in a space no larger than a small studio apartment. They were the lucky ones. They had survived a blast that had registered on seismic sensors in Alaska. But as the minutes turned into hours, luck began to feel like a cruel joke. Kolesnikov, only 27 years old, realized he was now the senior officer. He began to organize the men. They didn't panic. They used their hands to find one another in the pitch black. They shared the few remaining flashlights. The cold, the Barents Sea is 4 degrees C. Without the reactors running, the steel hull became a giant icebox. The men huddled together, skin to skin, trying to keep their core temperatures from dropping. The air, this is the most agonizing part of the story. Every breath they took was a countdown. As the CO2 levels rose, their heads began to throb. Their vision blurred. They became lethargic. The tapping every hour, on the hour, they took a heavy metal wrench and struck the hull. Clang, clang, clang. To the men inside, it sounded deafening. They were sure the ships above could hear them. They imagined the rescue divers already turning the wheel of the hatch. They told stories to stay awake. One young sailor talked about his mother's cooking. Another talked about the girl he was supposed to marry in October. But above them, the Russian Navy was still debating if there was even an emergency. The tapping went on for at least 48 hours. Think about that. 48 hours of hope slowly curdling into despair. Chapter 23. The Mother's Cry. Nadezhda Tylik and the Needle. Estimated runtime, 20 minutes. Audio note, the sound of a cold wind whistling through concrete apartment blocks. The tone of the narrator becomes sharp and emotional. In the town of Vidyayevo, the silence was different. It was the silence of a phone that wouldn't ring. Nadezhda Tylik, whose son was on the Kursk, spent the first 3 days in a state of vibrating shock. The story of the Kursk isn't just about sailors, it's about the women left in the Arctic fog. When the government finally called a meeting on the 10th day, the room was packed with hundreds of weeping, screaming, and exhausted relatives. The sedation of truth, Nadezhda stood up. She wasn't a politician, she was a mother. She pointed a finger at the admirals in their gold-braided uniforms and shouted the question the whole world was asking. Why are you lying? Why aren't you letting the foreigners help? As she spoke, a woman in a civilian coat moved through the crowd. In a moment caught on film that would haunt Russia for decades, the woman plunged a syringe into Nadezhda's back through her coat. Nadezhda's voice slowed, her eyes glazed over, and she was dragged from the room. It was the ultimate betrayal. The state didn't just fail to save their sons, they tried to chemically silence their grief. This chapter explores the deep-seated mistrust that this moment created. A mistrust that even in 2026 still defines the relationship between the Russian military and its people. Chapter 24. The Final Descent. The Norwegian Perspective. Estimated runtime, 20 minutes. Audio. Note: the rhythmic sound of a diver's breathing apparatus, hissing and bubbling. The narrator speaks with a sense of clinical tension. When the Norwegian divers from the Seaway Eagle finally reached the Kursk on August 21st, they were entering a tomb. These weren't just divers, they were elite technicians, working in conditions that would kill a normal human in minutes. The hatch, the lead diver, Tony Scott, moved his light over the escape hatch of compartment 9. He saw the damage. He saw the silt. He took his tool and tapped on the metal. No answer. The silence of the deep sea is absolute. When he finally opened the internal valve to test for life, he didn't hear voices. He heard the sound of water gurgling into a hollow space. He knew then that the 23 men were gone. This chapter details the grim process of entering the flooded ship. Moving through the silent city, the divers had to navigate through floating debris, personal letters, and the bodies of the men who had waited so patiently for a rescue that came too late. They found the air-scrubbing cartridges, burnt and melted, explaining the final flash fire that had claimed the survivors. Chapter 25. The Anatomy of a Shockwave. Forensic Reconstruction. Estimated runtime, 25 minutes. Audio note: the sound of a heartbeat monitor, slow at first, then a sudden jarring white noise static that fades into the sound of rushing water. The narrator's voice is clinical but intense. To truly understand the violence of what happened at 11:28 a.m. on August 12th, we must look at the forensics of the blast. The investigation that followed the recovery of the hull in 2001 revealed a story written in twisted steel. The first fault, it began with a microscopic crack. In torpedo tube number 4, a Type 6576 kit torpedo sat ready for a practice run. Inside its casing was high-test peroxide, HTP. Forensic experts later determined that a weld on the torpedo's fuel tank had failed. As the HTP leaked, it didn't just pool on the floor, it began to react with the copper and silver in the tube's plumbing. The temperature spiked to over 2,000 KURSK text/C in seconds. The first explosion was not the warhead itself, but the internal pressure blowing the torpedo tube doors open. The fire was so intense, it turned the air in the first compartment into a plasma of burning metal. The 2-minute countdown for 135 seconds, the Kursk was a wounded animal. The fire in the bow was feeding on the oxygen stored for the crew. But the real horror was the heat. Surrounding the leaking torpedo were 5 other live warheads. The physical pressure $, inside the compartment was rising exponentially. At 11:30 a.m., the heat reached the cook-off point of the remaining torpedoes. The resulting explosion was so massive it registered as a 2.2 magnitude earthquake. The physics of destruction, the second blast didn't just hit the bulkheads, it vaporized them. The pressure wave moved at 5,000 plus text/meters per second. To give you a sense of the scale, Compartment 1 disintegrated instantly. Compartment 2, Command Center, the 2-inch thick steel bulkhead was punched through like wet paper. The 36 men in the command center were killed by the shockwave before they could even realize they were sinking. The bubble pulse, the explosion created a massive gas bubble that expanded and collapsed under the ocean's weight, acting like a secondary hammer that shattered the internal structures all the way back to the reactor room. Chapter 26. The Diamond Saw, the Salvage of the Millennium, estimated runtime 30 minutes. Audio. Note the sound of a heavy industrial rhythmic grinding, like a giant saw cutting through rock. The sound of deep-sea sonar pings and heavy chains clanking. For nearly a year, the Kursk lay at the bottom of the Barents Sea. But the Russian government knew they couldn't leave it there. It was a matter of national honor and a matter of nuclear safety. The Dutch contract in early 2001, the Russian Navy hired Mamoet and Smit International. These Dutch engineers were faced with a problem that had never been solved. How do you lift 9,000 tons of radioactive, shattered steel from 108 meters without it breaking apart? The amputation, the bow of the Kursk, was too dangerous to lift. It was filled with unexploded torpedoes and jagged metal. The decision was made to saw the nose off the ship. They used a diamond-encrusted tungsten carbide cable. 2 giant hydraulic motors on either side of the wreck pulled this cable back and forth. For days, the cable chewed through the double-hulled reinforced steel. It was a sound that could be heard for miles underwater, a screaming metallic groan. The lift of a ghost on October 8, 2001, the barge Giant 4 positioned itself directly over the site. 26 giant jacks began to pull. The tension on the cables was measured in thousands of tons. Imagine the scene. The grey Arctic water began to churn. As the conning tower of the Kursk finally broke the surface, the recovery team saw the true extent of the tragedy. The ship was covered in deep-sea silt, and the massive 7-pointed star of the Oscar II's propeller was bent and silent. When the ship was finally towed into the dry dock at Roslyakovo, the silence was deafening. The engineers didn't cheer. They took off their hats. They were looking at a tomb that had finally come home. Chapter 27, The 118th Man, A Legacy in 2026, estimated runtime 15 minutes. Audio note. A solitary violin playing a mournful but hopeful melody, the sound of waves gently hitting a shore. As we conclude this 2-hour journey in the year 2026, we ask, what is left of the Kursk? The monument in the mist. If you travel to Murmansk today, you will see the conning tower of the Kursk. It stands on a hill overlooking the harbor. It is not just a piece of scrap metal. It is a place of pilgrimage. Families still come here to leave flowers, carnations that freeze in the Arctic air. The evolution of the sailor, the Kursk taught the world that unsinkable is a dangerous word. Because of the 118 men lost, every submarine in the world today carries better oxygen generators, more compatible rescue hatches, and a deep-seated respect for the volatile nature of torpedo fuel. The final silence. We end with the image of the Barents Sea. It is a vast, cold place that holds its secrets tightly. But for those who know the story of the Kursk, the water is no longer empty. It is filled with the echoes of 118 voices, the rhythm of a wrench hitting a hull, and the final handwritten words of a young officer who simply wanted his wife to know he wasn't afraid. The Kursk is gone, but she will never be silent. Chapter 28. The Ghost Town of Vidyayevo. Estimated runtime, 20 minutes. Audio note. The sound of a low, mournful wind blowing through rusted metal playground equipment. The narrator's voice is soft, almost whispering. Vidyayevo is a place that shouldn't exist. Carved into the granite of the Kola Peninsula, it is a zato, a closed administrative territorial entity. To enter, you need a special pass. To live there, you need a reason. In August 2000, the reason for everyone in Vidyayevo was the Kursk. The architecture of absence. Vidyayevo was built for the Cold War. Its apartment blocks are Khrushchevkas, grey, 5-story concrete boxes designed for utility, not beauty. Inside these flats, the wallpaper was peeling and the heat was unreliable, but the community was tight. It was a town of wives and children waiting for the silent service to return. When the Kursk didn't return, the town didn't just become sad, it became a ghost town. The school, every classroom had an empty desk. Teachers struggled to explain to 7-year-olds why their fathers weren't coming home from a training exercise. The grocery store. Women stood in line, not talking about bread or milk, but about the rumors they heard on the radio. The rumors that the Kursk had been rammed, or that the air was running out. For a month, Vidyayevo was the most famous town in the world, yet it remained the most isolated. This chapter explores the psychological toll of living in a town where your entire existence is tied to a steel tube at the bottom of the sea. Chapter 29. Saturation, the biological price of rescue, estimated, runtime 25 minutes. Audio, note the sound of high-pitched Donald Duck voices, the effect of helium on speech, the hiss of gas valves, and the heavy thud of a diving bell locking into place. While the world watched the surface of the Barents Sea, a small group of men lived in a different reality. The Norwegian and British divers on the Seaway Eagle were not just swimming, they were saturation divers. The living tomb. To work at 108 meters, these men lived for weeks inside a pressurized habitat, a series of interconnected steel tanks on the deck of the ship. They were pressurized to the same depth as the Kursk. The gas. They didn't breathe air. Nitrogen at that depth is toxic, causing the rapture of the deep. Instead, they breathed heliox, a mix of helium and oxygen. The speech. Because helium is much thinner than air, the sound of their voices changed. Even as they discussed the grim task of recovering bodies, they sounded like cartoon characters. It was a surreal, jarring contrast to the horror of their mission. The physics of the blood. If these divers had been brought to the surface quickly, the gases dissolved in their blood would have turned into bubbles, like opening a shaken bottle of soda. This is the bends, decompression sickness. The partial pressure of oxygen, had to be meticulously calculated to prevent oxygen toxicity. P-O2 E FSF O2 plus times AP total L, where HFF O2 miles is the fraction of oxygen in the breathing gas. P as total L is the total ambient pressure at 108 meters. Pressure approx 11.7. Text was at Mount. If the participation exceeded 1.4 watts tekras, the divers would suffer seizures. If it was too low, they would suffocate. They worked in a world where a single decimal point error in a gas mix meant death. Chapter 30. The Intelligence War. The Silent Observers. Estimated runtime 20 minutes. Audio note. The sound of radio static, high-tech sonar chirps, and the low rhythmic hum of a computer mainframe. The Kursk did not die in a vacuum. She died in the most heavily monitored piece of water on the planet. The SOSUS ears throughout the Barents Sea, the United States and NATO maintain a vast network of underwater microphones known as SOSUS, Sound Surveillance System. Every propeller turn, every dropped wrench, and every explosion is recorded. When the first ping of the HTP explosion occurred at 11:28:27 a.m., American SIGINT, Signals Intelligence, officers in Norway and at the Pentagon were alerted. They didn't need the Russian Admiralty to tell them something was wrong. They watched the acoustic signature of the second massive blast and knew instantly the target has been destroyed. The Shadow submarines, this chapter delves into the tension between the Russian Navy and the USS Memphis. For years, rumors persisted that the Memphis had collided with the Kursk. The game of chicken, Cold War-style maneuvering, was still common in 2000. Submarines would trail one another, trying to record sonar signatures. The evidence. While the collision theory was eventually debunked, the fact remains that the Americans were so close they could hear the Kursk hitting the sea floor. This chapter explores the ethical dilemma of the observers. They heard the banging on the hull, but they couldn't help without revealing their positions. Chapter 31, The Final Hour, a reimagined reenactment, estimated runtime 30 minutes. Audio note, no music, only the sound of heavy, slow breathing and the ticking of a watch. The narrator's voice is raw and emotional. We return to Compartment 9. It is now August 14th. The emergency lighting is gone. The 23 men are huddled in the dark. Dmitry Kolesnikov is no longer writing. He is resting. The air is so thick with carbon dioxide that every movement feels like running through chest-deep mud. The choice, in the dark, there is a conversation. It isn't recorded, but we can piece it together from the forensic evidence. They had a choice: try to leave through the hatch or wait. To leave, they would have to flood the compartment, swim through 100 meters of freezing water, and hope to be spotted on the surface. Without pressurized suits, their lungs would burst. They chose to wait. They chose to stay together. The final flash. A sailor reaches for a fresh chemical air scrubber. His hands are shaking from the cold. He fumbles. The cartridge slips into the rising, oily water at his feet. There is a hiss, a spark. In the high-pressure, oxygen-rich environment of the compartment, the fire doesn't burn, it explodes. For a fraction of a second, the dark room is filled with a blinding white light. Then, the oxygen is gone. The silence that follows is the silence that lasted for 26 years. Chapter 32. Epilogue. The sea forgives, but the world remembers. Estimated runtime, 10 minutes. Audio note. The sound of the ocean, calm and vast. A soft, uplifting orchestral theme begins to rise. As we close this 120-minute journey, we look at the Barents Sea in 2026. It looks exactly the same as it did in 2000. The waves are grey, the wind is cold, and the depths are hidden. But the Kursk changed us. It taught us that national pride is a hollow shield when compared to the value of a single human life. It taught us that the brotherhood of the deep is stronger than any border. The 118 men of the Kursk are no longer sailors of a specific nation. They are the guardians of the deep. Their story is a warning, a tragedy, and a testament. Narrator, you have been listening to The Deep Silence, the tragedy of the K-141 Kursk. Rest in peace, the 118. We have heard your heartbeat in the dark. Chapter 33, Return to the Soil, A Nation's Grief. Estimated runtime, 20 minutes. Audio. Note the sound of a steady light rain falling on umbrellas. In the distance, a somber military brass band plays a slow dirge. The heavy rhythmic tolling of Orthodox church bells provides a background beat. The autumn of 2001 was more than just a change of season for Russia. It was the closing of a painful chapter. When the massive hull of the Kursk was finally secured in the dry dock at Roslyakovo, the scene inside was described by investigators as a metallic graveyard. But the most sacred and harrowing task was yet to begin: bringing the 118 heroes out of the steel tomb. The identification process. Forensic teams worked in shifts, moving through knee-deep mud, silt, and the jagged remains of what used to be living quarters. They worked with a heavy silence, aware that every item they found, a watch, a family photo, a handwritten list, was a piece of a shattered life. Captain Gennady Lyakin. He was among the last to be recovered. True to the highest traditions of the sea, he was found at his post. He had stayed with his ship until the very end. The conscripts, many were barely 19. Their families stood at the gates of the shipyard, waiting for the confirmation they dreaded but needed: the funerals in the frost. As the bodies were identified, they were sent to their hometowns across the vast expanse of Russia. In St. Petersburg's Serafimovskoye cemetery, the air was bitter and frozen. The coffins were closed, but the Russian flags draped over them spoke of the sacrifice made beneath the waves. Mothers stood by the graves, clutching the last letters their sons had written months before the disaster. "The sea is so big, Mama," one had written. Now the sea had given them back, but only to be surrendered to the earth. This chapter explores the return to the soil, the idea that for a sailor, peace is finally found when the weight of the ocean is replaced by the embrace of the homeland. Chapter 34. The Fate of Steel, What Remains of a Titan. Estimated runtime 15 minutes. Audio note: the sound of heavy industrial grinding, the high-pitched screech of metal being cut by torches, and the eerie whistle of wind passing through a hollow metal pipe. What becomes of a Titan once its heart stops beating? The K-141 Kursk, an Oscar II-class monster that once made the world's superpowers tremble, met a domestic end. After the forensic investigations were completed and the nuclear fuel was safely removed, the ship was surrendered to the scrapyards. The recycling of a ghost, tons of high-grade reinforced steel were broken down. It is a strange thought. The steel that once protected 118 men at 100 meters depth was melted and reshaped. Today, parts of the Kursk likely exist in the skeletons of ordinary buildings or the hulls of civilian cargo ships. The weapon of war was dismantled, but its memory was too heavy to be melted away. The monument in the mist, while most of the ship was destroyed, one piece was saved: the conning tower, the sail. Today, it stands on a rocky hill in Murmansk, overlooking the grey waters of the Barents Sea. If you visit the monument, you can see the scars on the metal, deep gouges and discoloration from the extreme heat of the explosions. It has become a place of pilgrimage. Sailors touch the cold steel as they head out to sea, a silent prayer for a safe return. The conning tower is no longer a part of a weapon. It is a headstone. It stands as a bridge between the pride of the Russian Navy and the tragic reality of the men who served it. As the narrator concludes this chapter, the question is asked: when a ship dies, do the memories die with it, or do they settle into the steel forever?